In that same vein, let's get started with our discussion. So we're in the middle of this pandemic that keeps going and going and going, and we're facing a really tough budget season. And we've seen that the worst of the COVID is hitting these Black and brown neighborhoods that are already subject to too much pollution and asthma rates and things like that. But we are also facing a massive budget deficit. So why should we make clean transportation a priority now? Can we afford to make clean transportation a priority now? And I guess I'll open it up to any of our panelists who want to start the conversation.
I think we can't afford not to do anything right now at this point. I think that COVID has shown us that public health issues on a mass scale are affected by, can be affected by something as simple as your zip code. And that's ridiculous that where you live can determine your outcome in a pandemic. At the same time, speaking of budget issues, I mean, I can count on two hands the number of people I know who are interested in buying cars now that have never owned cars before because they're afraid of public transportation and the risk of transmission of COVID. We don't want to encourage more passenger vehicles on the road, but given that people are trying to prioritize their health, but still trying to get to work and things that they need to do, we want to make sure that they're doing the best thing that they can for their neighborhood, for their own health, for the health of the planet, and having access to electrified transportation.
You know, I'll go next, but you know, I'm afraid I'm gonna steal Oboi's thunder here. I mean, I think it's key that we have to protect public transportation. Um, you know, we're going to need it a year from now when everybody's had shots and COVID's sort of a distant memory. And I'm an optimist here that we're going to get to that point. We need to make sure transit is still there. I think that's, I mean, I'm not talking about electrification. I'm just talking about making sure transit period is there. I mean, right now we have a situation where transit is literally bleeding money, not only in Chicago, but other big cities. You know, CTA gets half of its budget from its fare box, you know, what people pay. If nobody takes transit, half of their money that keeps transit alive in Chicago disappears. Sales taxes, which are down, you know, supplies the other half. And so what's keeping public transit operational right now in Chicago and a lot of other places is just massive federal subsidies, which if they went away would cause a literal implosion of transit. You'd see, you know, half the bus routes disappear. You'd see nighttime service disappear. Fares would have to double just to be able to plug the hole that and keep something alive. You know, and that's it's an equity thing. It's a congestion thing. I mean, some people don't have cars. They need to take transit, and you know, letting the system erode is going to cause permanent problems for those people. They simply will not be able to get where they need to go. And for the other people that are now driving around because transit is now extremely inconvenient, are going to be causing a lot more congestion and a lot more air pollution for the rest of us as well. You know, I think simply being focused on keeping that transit system alive and functioning as long as possible will allow us to rebuild it over time towards a clean transportation system that, you know, has electric trains and has electric buses.
Brian, you are welcome to steal my thunder anytime. So a few things. One, the idea that economics somehow justifies racialized inequities is beyond evil, because we are talking about, in this context, racialized inequities that are harmful, that are physically harmful to people. And as Brian talked about some of the data, it's Black and brown people. It sounds like it's mostly Black people who are the most impacted by asthma, which is an outcome of poor air quality. And this is not, it's a legitimate question because we've seen this play out here in Chicago. When Divvy rolled out in our city, it was concentrated in predominantly white, middle to upper income neighborhoods. And the justification then was economics. And the neighborhoods that are the most impacted by obesity and heart disease and any number of healthcare inequities, that increased bike mode share could help address. The reason was given is economics. We're not able to bring this public resource to Black and brown neighborhoods. So let's call it what it is. It's evil, and we should not tolerate an economic reason for allowing inequities to continue to proliferate in our neighborhoods. And the second part of how I want to respond to this question is I'm not prepared to say that we're unable to afford it. We afford what we want. The city comes up with money all the time. There's Maggie Daly Park across from Millennium Park. The city finds ways to build what it wants and to resource what it wants. As people who live in this city, who express a commitment to racial equity, express a commitment to racial justice, we must organize and fight for the city to take care of us and to improve our life outcomes and keep transit going strong. Electrify transit, that's a critical part of improving life outcomes for Black, brown people in our society. So it's evil to think that it's not able to be done, and the money is there. I'm not going to make the assumption that we're unable to afford to make this happen.
Thank you. That segues right into our next topic. Can you briefly give me 2 ways that Chicago would benefit from a changed transportation system? What would that transportation system look like? In your work for mobility justice, what are you working toward? What's your goal, and what does it look like?
I can start. Well, we are thinking about electrification and electrified transportation as part of a multimodal system of mobility, where if one has to rely on a passenger vehicle, that they are electrified, that they're shared, that you don't have to own it. And at the same time, public transportation would be accessible, would be everywhere in the city, not in just certain neighborhoods. Today, I forget the exact number, but a vast majority of people who live on the north side are within half an hour of a public transportation ride to their workplace, whereas people on the south side are not. I foresee more multimodal and electrified versions of transportation bringing a less segregated city, hopefully, which would contribute both to economic prosperity that has been tends to favor more white and wealthier neighborhoods, but also dampen the price of housing and the cost of living, and hopefully allow for a better quality of life for everyone, regardless of what neighborhood you live in.
Obahi, did you want to speak to some of your work in this area?
Sure. The impact we want to have through all of our work in the transportation sector and environmental justice, the impact we want to have is reducing violence, improving health, and creating jobs, ultimately making our neighborhoods and cities more livable for Black, brown, and indigenous people. Now the question is, how do we get there? Within the transportation sector, there's a number of things that we consider, and I should share that the way we frame racial equity is clarified in our Equiticity Racial Equity Statement of Principle, which is available as a draft on our website. And the framing that we lean on for understanding mobility justice, to Kyra's earlier point during the introduction, is the Untokening's Principles of Mobility Justice. Those 2 documents really serve as the foundation for how we think about this work. Within transportation, there's a whole number of elements that we think about. One is owning the transportation planning process. Neighborhoods, the transportation planning process should reside and be owned at the neighborhood level. It should not be bureaucrats who don't live in our neighborhoods determining how transportation services and infrastructure is rolled out at the hyperlocal level. It should be people who live and work in our neighborhoods every day, who understand the needs and also understand the best solutions that need to be implemented to address those needs, that should be determining how those services and infrastructure is rolled out. We do see value in emerging transportation technologies. Again, though, we're concerned about those new technologies having a harmful impact on our neighborhoods. So that's why it's so important for us to own it and to be in a leadership role to ensure that the technologies are doing more good than harm. We, going beyond just owning the planning process, we also want to own the actual implementation of these technologies. So with regards to bike share, such as Divvy, owned by the city of Chicago, using a private firm to manage that system, and that system is based on a European model of cycling, considering bikes a form of transportation targeting commuters. We would like to implement a community-based model that is not prioritizing profitability, is prioritizing equity and justice and improved life outcomes. With respect to emerging transportation technologies, we want to deliver an autonomous shuttle in our neighborhoods to help people get to critical healthcare appointments and not wait on some private firm or some capitalist or some bureaucrat to bring that service. We want to bring it ourselves. And our advocacy position on anything that we believe could help our neighborhoods is that we stand on the forefront of ensuring that these programs or services or infrastructure or technologies are coming to our neighborhoods. We're not waiting for others to do it. We get on the front line and bring these to our neighborhoods first. We see transportation as a critical piece of improving life outcomes for Black and brown people in our city. It is a key element. Physical, geographic mobility is a key element of economic prosperity and social mobility. When you isolate people at a hyperlocal level to a certain geography, it limits their educational skills, it limits where they can find jobs, it limits recreational, civic engagement opportunities. Life outcomes are depressed when transportation is not robust for marginalized racial groups. So we see a future where transportation is resourced and every mode of transportation is available at our doorstep.
Wow,
Thank you. It's a tough act to follow.
Yeah,
Brian.
that is an incredibly tough act to follow. You just covered everything. But I mean, I am sort of a drummer with one stick here as well. I mean, my whole focus here is cleaner air because of the impact on lung health, and that's our laser focus. That's our mission. So I think one of the ways you would benefit from Chicago is improved health through improved air quality. Especially in areas where people are in close proximity to a lot of vehicles, whether those be, school buses or CTA buses or truck traffic or delivery vans. To look beyond mobility issues, which are important, it's hard. It's hard to draw a straight line from electrification to cleaner air because in the grand scheme of things, diesel vehicles and diesel engines are far more damaging to people's health than gasoline power engines. Not to say they're faultless, but diesel engines produce a lot more fine particulate matter, and fine particulate matter is the pollutant that is responsible for things like heart attacks and deaths overwhelmingly, far more than 10 times as many as ozone, which is made worse by gasoline fumes. So looking at things like public transportation and electrifying public transportation, CTA buses, buses go where people are, and they go where the most people are within a short distance from a bus stop. So buses travel through the most densely populated corridors in the city. So if you were going to clean up CTA buses and convert them to run on electricity and not emit diesel fumes, you would get the greatest public health benefit for the greatest number of people, because you're eliminating a dangerous source of air pollution precisely where the most people are. And again, we've started to look at this. We came out with a report, and I'll post a link in the chat in a minute. But we looked at the impacts of lung disease and living near transit, and through a study we did with the University of Chicago, we looked at high traffic or high passenger bus routes and low passenger bus routes, and we found out that the more bus traffic, the more passengers you have on a bus route, the higher the asthma rates and the higher the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease rates are along those routes. They're much higher than the city average. And if you live near a bus barn, where they often have hundreds of buses, the inequity is even higher. The disparities are even higher. You have higher rates of asthma than you would have along the routes. So again, in terms of what we're looking at, it's, I just hammered before on like how we need to preserve transit at all costs, but then beyond preserving the infrastructure and the services that it provides, we have to make sure that it's operating in a healthy manner for the people it's serving, not only passengers, but the people along the route, and as well as the staff that are driving the buses and repairing the buses.
Thanks. We've kind of touched on this in each part of our conversation, but the last question that we want to address, and we really just want to cut to the chase, is in a justice-centric transition, what voices do we need to center? How do they need to be involved in charting progress? And what does it look like when we've made progress?
I'd like to give an example about electric vehicle policy that I've seen in Chicago, and that's the issue that EVs are great, let's encourage them. And a lot of work that Chicago for EVs does is outreach in the suburbs where people can afford them, where they have the infrastructure as a garage or a driveway to not really have a question about infrastructure. And a lot of the biggest benefit of having an EV is being able to charge it at home and wake up to a full tank, so to speak. Once it comes to urban residents, though, we kind of just like, you live in an apartment, sucks for you, let's install public chargers. And when you live in a neighborhood that already is being actively disinvested in, as a lot of Black neighborhoods are, you see grocery stores leaving, businesses leaving, that already doesn't have investment as it should, and you're relying on a Whole Foods to come and install a charger, it's not going to serve the people of that neighborhood. At the same time, it's not like there are people who don't have single family homes in Chicago or any kind of off-street parking. And so we turn to EV readiness. EV readiness is the idea that buildings should have the capacity to support the infrastructure for electric vehicle charging at home. It's a lot of a code related to electrical wiring and conduit and stuff, but it doesn't even have to be that complicated. At the most simple, you can just use an everyday outlet if you have an off-street parking spot to charge at a really, really slow rate. But overnight, where most people in Chicago drive less than 30 miles a day, you would recoup all of that mileage back. And I know Brian uses that for his car. And I think that talking to people who actually have had the experience of owning an EV as an apartment owner or someone without a garage or a driveway, that would be a more obvious incentive for people to talk about that you don't have to have a special electricity situation or anything to be able to charge your EV. And I know we say it all the time in the environmental community of like having people who are affected by the policy at the table, but it really comes into fruition when you're talking about, how do we address the fact that city dwellers don't have as good infrastructure? Should we spend millions and billions of dollars on fast chargers and chargers in neighborhoods where we don't even go into the neighborhood and ask them where they want us to put the charger? The electricity is already there. People are living there. It's in their homes. They have off-street parking already. And it's really just a matter of seeing what those needs of the people who are living there are and giving them the same benefits and the access that people in the suburbs can have.
Thank
I'll,
you.
I'll say quickly, the people who are leading the work around racial equity must be the people who are experiencing the most racialized inequities. I mean, that's just a real basic concept, you know. It shouldn't be that difficult. The folks who are the most impacted by racialized inequities should be leading the work to bring racial equity to the forefront in our city and in our neighborhoods. Oftentimes we see bureaucrats and white-led organizations that want to be at the forefront of this work, and it's actually on the backs. Racial equity, the organizations that are now jumping on this bandwagon are on the backs of Black people in this city who've been fighting for racial equity for me 10 years. And I was fighting for it, and many others were fighting for it when it was not a buzzword, when there were few people even willing to say the word equity, let alone express a commitment to it. And now that we have a mayor who expresses a commitment to equity, now that, you know, it's a buzzword and everybody's talking about it, organizations are now wanting to stand up and talk about their support for equity. We're not going to allow racial equity to be co-opted. We believe in the power of racial equity. We believe in the potential for it to be transformative in our neighborhoods. And we're not going to allow people who don't have any operational commitment to it, and it's only skin deep, to be at the forefront of this work. Black, brown, and indigenous people will lead on this work.
I don't know what more I could add on this. Everything Oboi said is directly on point. You know, it's interesting too to look at, just to go back to electric cars. I mean, we have a situation where you have electric chargers that are out there in the community, public chargers that are at, you know, outside of a business or in a school parking lot or in a grocery store parking lot or something like that. But if you look at places like, you know, between the Eisenhower Expressway and the Dan Ryan Expressway, and a vast swath of the south and west side of Chicago, there's just basically no chargers there. And when people want to get an electric vehicle, yes, they want to charge it at their house, and they charge it at their house most of the time if they have a place to plug it in. But you know, even if they have a place to plug it in, you want to be able to, you want to feel safe. You want to feel like you can have a vehicle that, you know, if you made a mistake and, you know, you didn't charge it up, that you could charge it somewhere and not be stranded. And it, you know, growth in people buying EVs and, you know, having that charger network out there, you know, it's like you wouldn't buy a gasoline car if there were no gas stations anywhere. You'd freak out. It's sort of the same thing, and it's sort of holding back certain neighborhoods from getting access to electric vehicles. And I realize, you know, people take transit, people need those other modes, but a lot of people are going to have cars. I mean, all neighborhoods have cars. People use them for all kinds of different reasons. And when you look at what's going to happen going forward, people are going to save money with electric cars. The Consumer Reports just came out with a report that says electric cars literally cost half the amount of repairs and maintenance compared to like a gasoline powered car. If you look at how much it costs to fuel or charge an electric car, you know, it can be as low as a quarter of, you know, what it costs to per mile compared to a gasoline powered car. And we're reaching, the technology is moving so fast that, you know, we expect to see new car sticker prices to be more or less equal for electric cars and gasoline powered cars in only about 4, maybe 5 years. So this is coming where you're going to see a world starting, 5, 6, 7 years from now, where people with electric cars are paying a lot less money for mobility, and people who are not riding in electric cars are going to be paying proportionally more. So when we're looking at some of the state legislation to push funding to get electric car charging stations in lower income communities of color, it's because it's going to take a long time to get that infrastructure out there. And if you don't have it there, people will be essentially forced to have cars that cost them more to run, and it will worsen the historic inequities that we've seen already so far.
Thank you so much. I think it's important to reiterate that, yeah, you wouldn't buy a gas powered car if there were no gas stations, and there are no charging stations in many of our neighborhoods. Well, I think we're running up on time. Were there any questions?
Yeah, if you have a question for one of our panelists, we encourage you to either drop it in the chat or, at this point, does anybody have any questions? We could maybe just ask it out loud too.
Sure, I'll ask a question. So I've been talking with the Southwest Environmental Alliance, a group on the Southwest side, about electrifying transportation in their neighborhood and their community. And I'm just wondering what are sort of the policy options that Chicago faces when promoting electric transportation in a community like the Southwest side?
Are you talking about barriers or challenges?
Yeah, challenges, or what different policies the city might choose to implement in that area.
I think you can ramp up from the higher cost stuff, like literally installing chargers for people, giving massive incentives to make it price parity with gas cars, all the way to the lower cost policies like EV readiness, which can cost less than retrofitting, as well as we push right to charge, which is a really big deal for renters and condo owners, so that you don't have to fight with your landlord or your condo board just to be able to plug in your car. Simple things like that give people the protection and the kind of the power necessary to know that they can get something that they're entitled to if they have a parking spot in an apartment that they rent. There's a plug there and they can use it and work something out. And you don't have to be an EV expert to figure out how much that should cost and what your responsibility should be, what the landlord's responsibility should be, and making sure that the barriers that people who live in disadvantaged neighborhoods face have at least some thought in the policy making that try to address those, which right now I think may be stressing a little bit too much about public charging as opposed to community available charging costs, things that people face that maybe are less talked about.
Yeah, and props to Neda for pushing at the city to get the ordinance passed that requires new construction or big renovations to have that EV ready component put in from the get-go, because that's important. It makes it so much easier over the long run to be able to have people access, have access to charge electric cars when that piping and stuff is already put in, which is literally, I think 5 times more expensive if you do it after the fact. So it just makes so much sense to make sure that's done up front. And that requirement for new construction and big renovations was passed in, I was gonna say April or May, or April or March. I think it was April.
Right, renovations are not counted though. That's the state bill.
Oh, this is state bill. Okay, well, at least for the new construction. And that actually goes into place now, right? Isn't it like this week? Anything, I think in October, is going to have to meet these requirements. So it's fully phased in. That's important. I think another thing that's the city's going to have to work on for places like the Southwest side or Southwest side or other places is what do you do about the big truck problem? And that's sort of a challenge because, electric buses are out there and there's you can make a cost argument saying it makes more sense to have an electric bus in place because you do save money over time. Electric cars, it's a little easier to, the technology's out there. There's going to be dozens and dozens of new models coming out over the next 2-3 years. When you get to electric trucks, it's a little harder because those are the things that are privately owned, and they're some of the biggest, dirtiest vehicles out there, the most polluting vehicles. They're running around delivering stuff. They're going to warehousing operations. They're serving factories. And one of the things the city is starting to do is looking at how do you remove barriers and encourage companies to electrify trucks. There's a set of guidelines on the city's Drive Clean program. It's the commercial vehicle electrification guidelines, where they're starting to figure out, like, how do you talk with developers and how do you talk with people who want to build big facilities to make sure that you have electrical access for those, that there's the piping goes in early, that you're not penalizing people or creating some cost barriers for them through just sheer municipal incompetence or cluelessness. So it's, for me, it's kind of frustrating in terms of, like, those are some of the biggest polluters out there and the biggest things contributing to local air pollution, and yet they're the hardest nut to crack because of the technology being way behind electric cars and electric buses, and the commercialization of the technology being not quite there yet. But that's something that's, the city's going to have to address and proactively work to solve going forward, I think.
I'll be brief here. In terms of policies, I think we should really think big picture, and then kind of take that big picture approach and explore how does that work in the context of this conversation around electrification. Big picture, we need racial equity legislation in the city of Chicago. We don't leave a commitment to racial equity to well-meaning people. Well-meaning people come and go. We policy that commitment. We legislate that commitment. The city of Chicago needs to pass authentic, sincere, uncompromising, comprehensive, full-throated racial equity legislation. And we consider racial equity an economic system. At the core of racial equity is the fair, just distribution of resources. Now, what does it take to ensure that we're distributing resources in a fair, just way to address racialized inequities? It requires an analysis, a racialized analysis, to better understand the severity of the inequities that exist in our city. Based on that analysis, we need a mathematical formula to determine how resources are distributed. We don't want some bureaucrat sitting in an office saying, "Oh, okay, we're gonna put some resources over here and we're gonna put some resources over there." We want a mathematical formula that is the result of a comprehensive analysis of the inequities, and then that formula determines how resources are distributed. And the resources are distributed to achieve some explicit outcomes. That's the purpose of this new way of distributing resources, to achieve improved life outcomes for marginalized racial groups. Those outcomes should be public. We should know what those outcomes are. And of course, all of this should be owned and led by Black and brown people, as I talked about prior. And then we need a public accountability model so that we understand how the resources are being distributed. We understand, are the outcomes being met? And should the outcomes are not being met, there's a mechanism of power for people in neighborhoods to come to the city and say, okay, look, we executed this project. It's not quite working. We need to make some adjustments. All of that, and that's just, me riffing here, all of that and a more formalized approach should be policied. It should be legislated. It should not be left to people who sometimes care about this stuff and sometimes don't. It should be policied and legislated in our city. And you could take everything I said, and you could take that and put it on electrification. So there should be legislation that says how we're distributing electric charging stations, or what bus routes are getting electric buses. We should understand the asthma rates. We should understand the public health inequities that exist around poor air quality, and that should determine where bus routes are going with electrification. So I'm again, big picture, and then you drilled that down to what we're talking about in this conversation around electrification.
Thank you so much. That was so informative. This has been a great evening for me. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and I will kick it back over to Kyra.